The following is a presentation of the Mat Talk Podcast Network.
It's time to attack. With the Attack Style Wrestling Podcast. Here on the Attack Style Wrestling Podcast, you'll find youth and high school coaching tips for coaches, parents, and wrestlers, featuring Gable-trained NCAA champion and Hall of Fame high school coach Daryl Weber. Also featured is a monthly dialogue with legendary wrestling coach Dan Gable. Find out more on AttackStyleWrestling.com. Now, on to the show. Welcome back to the Attack Style Wrestling Podcast. Jason Bryant and Daryl Weber as we continue our series on the anatomy of a perfect practice plan. And Coach Weber, last time we talked about the pre-practice speech and the warm-up. Today, we'll be focusing on that move from the warm-up into the drilling, the quick drills, and the technique. So let's just give you some brief recap. We went over the crucial components last time with light jogging, the calisthenics, the gymnastics-oriented, the solo drills, and the games that you talked about. And, what was the general consensus of how to wrap up that warm up and get right into our next segment, which is the quick drills?
Yeah, quick drills is something. It's kind of a term I just made up myself, and it's a kind of a section of practice that I developed over the years when I was head coach. And the quick drills. So in your warm up, like I said, like we talked about, you're easing into it, and you're kind of ending with those solo drills. Your heart rate is spiked up. You're ready to go. And quick drills is where I like to focus a lot on the neutral technique. And the neutral because neutral technique is the hardest to develop. Top is probably the easiest because you start off in a dominating position. Bottom is difficult, but bottom, you don't have to focus on a whole lot to get good at the bottom position. There's a handful of moves, and then your chain wrestling skills and base building and clearing wrists and stuff like that. But when you get to the neutral position, it's very, very complex from, just the basic steps it takes to, execute a proper shot. Then you got to get into setups, and you got to get into finishes, and then your chain wrestling and front headlocks and defense. And so it's a very complex position that needs the most repetition. So over the years, I just designed this quick drill segment of practice, and it would usually, be 5 to 15 minutes, just depending on how it goes. And this is where I would always pick a series. Maybe I want to work high crotches, and I really want to focus on the setups. So we can go out and say, okay, we're going to hit high crotches with our number one finishes where you head drive across to a double leg, and I'm going to call out, and it's high intensity. They're already warmed up. They're drilling here. They're working with each other, and I call out different setups. Maybe you're going in and out, and you post up an elbow and you hit it. Okay, then you go underhook to high crotch. Then you go elbow control to high crotch, and that would be a quick drill segment where I really wanted to focus on setups to a high crotch. You could do the same thing for finishes. You could say, okay, we're just going to use your favorite tie up, your favorite setup for high crotch, and I'm going to call out different finishes. The first one is a head driver cross double leg. The second one, you're going to Iranian the guy. Third, and then you click through your finishes. And obviously you can do that with single legs, with double legs, with low singles, front headlocks, all this stuff. But you're getting high intensity reps, and then sometimes, you'll mix in too, where it's okay, I want you to go out and execute your best stuff. But it's always a strong focus on the neutral position. It's high intensity. Ideally, in the quick drills, it's executed perfectly. They're explosive. They're doing, and I always sometimes I'll come in with a couple key points that maybe we're not doing in live competition, and we're not finishing shots, or we're not scoring because of this. And I'll really hone in on these couple positions, or these couple parts of the technique. So, for example, it might be maybe we're keeping our heads down and our butt out on our double legs. All right, I'm going to say, okay, well, we're going to hit our double legs, and we're going to use these setups, blah, blah, blah. But if I see one person stick their butt out, drop their head, I want to see a head up in the armpit driving across, then we're going to start over. We're going to do this for 3 minutes. One person sticks their butt out, we're starting over. And it develops focus on these little parts of these techniques that you really need to focus on. So sometimes I'll go into this quick drill segment with something pinpointed, one or two things pinpointed that are holding us back. And then sometimes we'll just get going and I'll see one or two things just jump out at me and I'll have to call them out on that. And like I said, ideally you click through this stuff, you get through it, you get a good reps. It's high intensity. And then sometimes they might just not look good at all. And you got to just say, all right, start over. We're going to have to teach this again. And sometimes you got to do that. And sometimes all you got to do is threaten that. And they want to get through the quick drills. So they sharpen up just like that. But anyways, it's a strong focus on the neutral position. You're not going real long, but you're picking up the intensity and you're really trying to you're not just going in there blindly, like, okay, go drill on your feet. You're really trying to learn. You're trying to do some deep practicing during that segment.
Now, there's a variety of coaching styles and systems that have been enacted basically from the dawn of time, since Milo of Croton, or the original manuscript, the first manual that's sitting in, I believe, one of the national museums in New York City or Washington, D.C. That was the first manual, was a sports manual about wrestling. So the idea of teaching technique goes back to the BC era. But there's still 5 things, the 5 methods of wrestling technique in teaching that we get into. So let's just start out with the first technique, the show and go, which seems self-explanatory in terms of show and go.
Yeah, I mean, these are kind of 5 or even 6 methods we might even get into that I've used, and there's just different times that they work better. And I used to, when I first started coaching, I used to go straight from warm up into technique. But then I started inserting that quick drill segment just so I could get more reps and more muscle memory every single day. If you did 5 to 15 minutes every single day, all season long, that really adds up, those high intensity reps. And all the things in the quick drill are things that have been taught before that they should know. Okay. So I just wanted to kind of, point that out before we get in. So then, after that, we'll slow it down and we'll go into technique. This is where we get into our technique and where we're breaking things down. And we're either teaching new stuff or we're reviewing things that maybe we're not doing good at. And a lot of times, deep into the season, the technique portion that we're going to talk about now, a lot of times is a heavy emphasis on the top position and on the bottom position. Like maybe mid-season, we should know what we're going to do in the neutral position, and we're just getting high intensity reps. Now you might be struggling with your finishes or this or that, and you have to break it down. But, I would say, if I had to put a number on it, 75% of the time, once your neutral, the core of your neutral technique has been taught, the technique session is going to be focusing on top and bottom. And like I said, I want to get into, in another podcast, I want to get into kind of my philosophies on teaching top and bottom, because there's different teaching styles that are very, very effective in each of those. And they're really different as well. So get into the first teaching method, this is show and go. It's the standard old, show the technique, let them go work on it and bring them back in. But this, I'm a firm believer that you do not want to, talk for 20 minutes, let the kids go out there, flounder around for a little bit, then move on to the next thing. You've got to, I always want to be riding that line. Like I talked about at the beginning, I want to be riding that line of their abilities. I want to be, keep them moving. And I think you're better off maybe showing a technique from beginning to end, point out the finer points, and then get them out there, let them mess up, find out what most of them are messing up on, bring them back in, go over it again, point out that one thing, get them back out there. Maybe they're messing up on another thing, bring them back in, teach that one thing that they're messing up, and keep doing that. Keep them moving, keep them learning, keep them making mistakes and correcting mistakes, and they're thinking, they're moving, they're being active, and they're thinking the whole time. And that's how the best coaches I know teach wrestling, teach anything really, any other sports, is you got to keep them moving, keep them thinking, keep them, right at that edge. And everybody's going to be a little bit different, and in a brand new kid, he might be struggling with the technique itself, and it's going to be a struggle just to get the movements down. Where one of your veterans might be just struggling with really one of the finer points, and you need to point that out and make sure he's working or they're working on that finer point. The good coaches know this. They know each of their athletes, and maybe they assign assistant coaches to watch the younger kids or less experienced kids and make sure they're just going through the mechanics properly. And then you're all over one of your veterans because every time somebody gets on his leg, he sprawls for a second and then he stops sprawling and he gets taken down. So you're making sure they sprawl and they're going picking up the pace a little bit. They're doing a little bit of sparring, but that's the show and go. But I'm really against putting them to sleep with the big long presentation, going through the whole thing and then sending them out. I like to just keep them moving, going in and out, and let them make their mistakes, fix the mistakes so they're thinking about it, and then keep moving and keep going through that cycle till you like what you see. And I think a mistake I used to make when I was new to coaching high school level is I would go into practice. I had way too many techniques. I'd be like, I want to go through this, and if I had 8 things listed to go over in technique, I'd get through 2 or 3. But I learned real quick that that's fine to do. Don't make the mistake of hustling through everything just to get through everything, and they suck at everything. When you list out your techniques you want to go over, list them by importance. So the most important thing that they need to know is at the top. And if it takes the whole time that you've allotted to teach technique that day, just to do that one thing, that's good. That's fine. And then plan for the future to hit the other things, but make sure they get good at. You want them to get good at, a few things rather than just be average at a bunch of things.
Yeah, and these methods, they can all go intertwined because we'll go to our next one, which is step by step, which also kind of goes hand in hand with the show and go because you can, morph these things into different technique. It's not like there's this way, and this way. But the next one, step by step, which seems to be the most instructional for first time coaches and coaches with brand new kids, is not like, you get a seasoned kid, you can show them a Granby roll and be like, all right, now try that. First time kid, you're going to have to go step by step with wrist control and things like that. So explain how you build step by step into your perfect practice plan.
Yeah, you're exactly right. These are going to morph with each other and they're going to play off of each other as well. So the step by step is basically where you take your technique from beginning to end and you segment it out. You got to create little breaks in the technique that make sense. And so you'll say, okay, maybe it's let's just say a stand up, okay, and maybe your first one is you're going to blow the whistle, and they're gonna explode up and get hand control. They're not even to their feet yet. They got maybe one leg up, one knee down, but they got hand control. Their hips are in front. Okay, everybody looks good. They got the hand control locked out. Their hips are out. They're headed up. They exploded. You check all those little components, and then then you blow the whistle or you say hit it again, and they drive to their feet and they're low in their stance. They got hand control still. They're doing that portion, and then the third one is a hip heist away. So there's the 3-part example. But you can do that with a lot of most techniques. So you want to kind of just chunk it out, make sure they know each chunk, and then once you see them executing each chunk, then you start melding them into one movement again. Obviously you wanted one explosive movement from beginning to end, but a lot of these techniques you have to chunk out. And a lot of times I'll go out, especially, if you got a young group, you might just start with the step by step. A lot of times the high school group, it'll be, all right, let's work on this, this setup finish, shot finish, or this little series, and we go out and they're just missing the boat on a couple things. Well, then I got to back it off and do step by step. And I won't go through that. I'll go through that as long as it takes to see everybody executing each step properly. And then it's like, okay, and then maybe you just eliminate one step. Rather 3 steps, then it goes to 2 steps, then it goes to 1 step, then it's all one component. There's just different ways to work it. But you're right, they play off of each other. And the young guys, you might just go in and start with the step-by-step. The older guys, You might hope that they can execute the whole thing properly from beginning to end. And if they're not, break it down, make them think, walk it through, keep their attention. That's what it's all about. That's how you get a lot out of them throughout the whole practice.
So once we've got that, we get the kids are starting to understand things, especially if we're getting the first time kids like, okay, step by step. Now you're ready. You can go back to the show and go, and then you can mix it up. What do you mean by mix it up?
Mix it up. What I mean by mix it up is mixing up live, like situational wrestling and teaching. So maybe you've taught your techniques. They've gone over this stuff. They know it. But as we all know, any coach knows, any wrestler knows, just because you can drill it perfectly doesn't mean you can do it in live situation. So you put them in situations and start going maybe short periods. Maybe you start them off, you've been working on high crotches. Maybe you start them off in the high crotch. You give a 20-second go and they're supposed to finish. Or, there's a lot of different positions. You can start them in different top positions. You can start them with a half. And hopefully, they're going to, when they blow the whistle, they're going to turn them over with that half, stuff like you put them in these situations so that they can learn the techniques. They give them an advantage. So they can kind of work them in live situations. They're going live. And then you start doing those, and maybe nobody's finishing. Maybe nobody's being successful, or a majority of them are not being successful because of one thing that they're not doing. One of the best techniques to get good at with this mix it up, going between situational and situational live and teaching, is leg defense from the bottom position. So maybe you go a couple live situations, and when you go live, you're going to see, what they're lacking. So you stop. You don't have to keep going and screaming at them and if it's not working, stop, go back to technique to that, and really point out the one finer thing that's holding them back, or the two finer, the points that are holding them back. Drill it a little bit, go back to live. And go back and forth between those two things. Like I said, bottom position is really, this is a really good way to learn how to wrestle from the bottom and develop your skills at the bottom. Same with top turning guys. So anyways, mix it up is just going back and forth between putting them, after they've learned the techniques, then put them in live, set them up so that they should succeed, give them an advantage in some fashion. And if they're not, then coach them up and then go back to it and go back and forth there.
Now, the sport of wrestling is a science. The sport of wrestling is a martial art. So when we use the term engineering in the sport of wrestling, it fits. And in this case, we're going to try to now, our next technique is reverse engineering, or reverse engineering technique, as where we work backwards and say, okay, this is why this works. This is why this works. How do you build in the proper way to teach a way to reverse engineer different techniques?
Yeah, there's just some techniques that when you start teaching them, it's going to be really hard for them to understand by learning it from the beginning to the end. They pick it up much quicker if you start at the end and then work your way back to the beginning. And I'll give you two examples that this is, I reverse engineer these techniques every time I teach them. Number one is the bear hug. So if you want to teach a double underhook bear hug, the best way to teach it is put your athlete in the finishing position, like in the neutral, when they're both on their feet. So teach them how their head, the ear is supposed to be low in their chest. They're locked low in the back. Their hips are in. Put them in that perfect position, and then maybe have them crunch them down and put them on their back and finish. But then you work back all the way to where they're jamming an underhook, throwing the guy up. But a lot of times, if you start with, for instance, that technique by just saying, okay, jam your underhooks in, get your hips in, elevate them up, lock, get your bear hug lock. They can't get all those pieces. They don't. The big one on that is most of them don't understand how to keep their hips in. So it's effective. They always want to stick their butt out. So you got to get them really comfortable in that position. And the other one that I always do is a stand-up. Stand-up. I always like to teach stand-up, starting where the guy's on his feet or the wrestler's on their feet. They got hand control. They're low in their stance, and they can move around there up on their feet. And then you back it all the way down to their base position. Because if you start with the base and you work your way up, you get most of your wrestlers, they're hitting their stand-ups and they're straight-legged and they don't have hand control. They can't move around up there. So I like to get them comfortable, low on their stance, hand control, moving around, and then hitting your hip heist, and then back and then reverse engineer that technique all the way back to starting from your base and exploding up and hitting it. So those are just two examples where it's best to kind of start at the end, start that finishing position, and then work all the way to the beginning.
Do you find that the reverse engineering works when you're trying to get into these funk situations? As we will get further on into our live wrestling in another episode, but when we get kids that are they're good scramblers, they're good funkers, and you're like, all right, well, you know what? I know that technique, and somebody wants to know how to pass a leg. When you basically you start upside down and be like, okay, we want to get away from here. I mean, when do you look at a technique and be like, this is where I have to start from it to reverse engineer it?
I mean, when I would say you look at techniques where towards the end of it, there just is where most of the struggle is. Like I said, like a stand-up. A lot of times kids can get their feet, but they're just always standing up straight. They don't know what position to be in up there. Not necessarily. I don't know necessarily about the funk stuff and rolls, about starting them, because those are kind of really free-flowing. I mean, you can't. Those are hard to chunk out a lot of times too. It's basically if at the end of that technique is where they're always losing it, then you might want to start at the end and back up. Like for instance, the stand-up. For instance, bear hugs. Usually when guys are going in for bear hugs, they don't get good at them because they don't know how to commit their hips. They don't know how to get a low lock, have their ear down the chest, so they're not getting headlocked. So get them really good in that position, and then it's easy to explode to that position and finish.
So once we've got all those things, then we get to the point where we're getting more towards live wrestling, but we're still drilling, we're still going through the technique of it, and that is sparring.
Yeah, and sparring, that's where you're adding some complexity to the technique. So before you're working, when you're drilling, basically, your opponent's letting you do, they're being good partners, they're giving you the proper amount of resistance, but they're allowing you to get all the mechanics down and get the feel down of that technique. And, and while you're doing all those other techniques and those or other teaching styles, you should be always up in the level. So, building, not just teaching one technique at a time. Once they get one, then you should be flowing into a chain wrestling series and stuff like that. And then, in a natural flowing chain wrestling series, you want to put some thought into it, and, certain moves just flow together better than others. And then you want to get into sparring where they're basically going back and forth, and they're going, one guy's going 100%, another guy's going, 80, 90%. And you want, how I always used to explain it to my guys, say in the neutral position when they're sparring, your opponent, the guy that's maybe the offensive wrestler in sparring, should not be able to come across and get their first tie up or set up into their shot and use their first finish. Okay, they should be hand fighting. They should be having to know how to hand fight and maybe getting one tie up and you lose that and coming back to it again and then get to your shot and they go for their number one finish and the guy sprawls or he rolls, does something else and you got to react. So, if they can get one tie up, one shot, one finish, you're not doing your job. And saying kind of the same mentality in the top and the bottom. If they can get the top position, if they can get one breakdown to one hold and roll you over in sparring, well, you're not doing your job. You should be fighting that first breakdown, and then they got to get something, and maybe they try to, run a normal half. They can't get that. Okay, so they got to sweep half, and then they got to spike you over. And you should have been working these chain wrestling techniques already in the technique portion. So you're getting everything to flow together. And I tell you what, when you get some wrestlers doing this, and it doesn't take long to figure this out. Man, they look like a Division I room. I mean, you'll just see the wrestling come to another level, and it gets them really tired as well. It's a great conditioner as well. So it's really good to do right before you go into live to make sure they're mentally sharp and they're physically sharp and ready to go as well.
Yeah, and this is also, depending on the part of the world and the type of coach you've got, this is also commonly referred to as play wrestling as well. And before we get too deep into that topic, which can be a whole nother episode, that is where some technique evolves. And the teaching, you see the kids really understand where all those techniques that they've learned come into play. It's like, oh, this is a situation where I can definitely learn here. So that play wrestling, we've seen it really, you've seen coaches like Cale Sanderson at Penn State really preach how his wrestlers really develop their technique through the play wrestling concept. David Taylor was a big proponent of how he got better in that Penn State room was with via sparring or play wrestling.
Yeah, I mean, that's where your athletes develop their individual styles. As a coach, you want to have your core techniques that they all got to know, and then you have your own flavor and all that. And you're teaching them all of these things, but you want them to get really, really good at a couple things. And that's where in the sparring sessions, that's where they'll develop that. If you've taught them 20 moves in the past month, they might just hone in on 5 of those and own those 5 moves. And those are their go-to moves that they can force on their opponents. And that's what you want.
All right, Coach Weber, final thoughts on the technique again, show and go, step by step, reverse engineering, mixing it up, and the sparring and play wrestling. Yeah,
I mean, it's just, every method isn't made for every technique. Every technique isn't made for, you just got to kind of figure things out. And, the whole objective is for the kids to learn it. And, I see that sometimes, a coach will go out and they know the technique, they show it, and the kids just don't pick it up, and they just get frustrated and they put it on the kids. Well, that's not coaching. If your teaching style is not, taking those techniques and crossing them over into live wrestling, well, you got to use some of these different techniques and styles that we're talking about to get through to them. That's your job, to figure out how to get through to those kids. And, sometimes it's a lot easier said than done. But here's enough weapons right here, because when I put this list together, that's about every teaching style that I've probably used that I could think of in one way or another. And like you said, they kind of bounce off of each other. And the mix it up one, you're using live wrestling and technique, teaching technique at the same time. And then sparring takes it to another level. So, you got to get in there and just figure out what they need to get to actually develop those techniques and what's going to get the best results, per series, per technique, per position.
This has been part 2 of our series, The Anatomy of a Perfect Practice Plan. A reminder that you can get a download of the complete cheat sheet of The Anatomy of a Perfect Practice Plan at attackstylewrestling.com.
Show is part of the Matt Talk Podcast Network. For more wrestling podcasts, head over to MattTalkOnline.com.